Hello and welcome to the video for how do I make a loading system using level streaming. I'm going to go ahead and start this example up and then we will go over it. So it has a splash screen as you just saw. I have a default main menu here, and if I click start game it loads and then we are in the game. I've also made a variation where it starts. If I hit this button, which actually loads a separate map, this one will load in and play a short matinee, so that way it kind of goes into the player. I have no player model, so you'll have to use your imagination. So let's go ahead and cover how we did that. I used level streaming for the entire thing. All of these started with animated loading, and basically I used that just as the first part of the files I named just to make it easier to separate from the other level streaming examples. So this entire system consists of basically 4 primary maps and then any additional maps, which are our individual levels. We have our persistent level, which just like you would for any level streaming, contains all of our other maps. Inside of that, I have our splash screen, which is our first one, which will then go into our main menu. After you make an option, the main menu passes information to the loading screen, which will then load up whichever map we have chosen. I tried to make this as generic as possible, and I used a game instance so we could pass information around and load up the appropriate map. So let's cover how we did it. First of all, let's open up our persistent level and we'll go into our blueprint. And as you can see, this one's pretty simple. We load in the loading splash screen and tell it to make it visible after we've loaded it. But then I also use a new event that most people may not know about called remote event. What this does is, from a level blueprint, you can call all the other level blueprints that are loaded and it will fire off the event that you tell it to fire off. Basically, the event begin play on a streamed level seems to fire before it's visible, so you will run into an issue if you're trying to access something in that level and it's not actually loaded yet. By doing this, after I've made it visible, it will fire off and the actual streaming level will be loaded and it will fire the event appropriately. So we have our remote event and I've named it load splash screen. So if we open up our splash screen level blueprint, we can see we have our load splash screen event. So this one's pretty simple, and this is pretty much the same format I used for anything that had an actual display. I'm using UMG to create a widget. My widget is simply called splash screen. If we go ahead and we open up our splash screen, it's pretty simple. It says awesome splash screen of awesomeness, and that's it. It's pretty simple. So going back to our code, I simply load that, set it a variable, add it to our viewport, and then I go ahead and load up our next streaming level, which will be our main menu. Now, since this is kind of generic and I don't really have anything and our actual levels themselves are small, I went ahead and put in a small delay here. This could be where you are loading up additional things, or maybe you intentionally have a pause because you want your player to read your splash screen. So after anything we've done, we then remove our widget from the screen, call the remote event on our newly loaded streamed level, and we're calling load main menu, and then I go ahead and unload the splash screen. I designed it like this so that way the individual levels will control themselves and take care of themselves. They will create anything that's needed, remove anything that's needed that they've created, and then let go of themselves once they're done. It makes things nice and compact and compartmentalized. So after we've done this, well, we need to go check out the load main menu. You'll notice this one's pretty much the same thing. We'll go to the level blueprint, and here's our load main menu level blueprint. Basically, we create our widget, set it as a variable, add it to the viewport, and then I go ahead and set our UI mode to our input mode to user interface only, and set to show the mouse cursor, so that way we can actually do something. Now, our main menu, again, pretty simple. It's just a screen with 2 buttons. All I'm doing on the buttons themselves is I have a continue and start button. You'll notice the code themselves is identical. All we're doing is changing this variable here. What I do is I get our game instance. Our game instance is basically something that is unique. It is for this project. It is created when the project starts and destroyed when the project ends, and is persistent at all times. So I have a unique game instance I created. If we find that right here, we'll find all it does is simply contain a name called level to load. That's all I'm using this for, simply to hold a variable across scenes. So we go ahead and set that variable to animated loading map 1, which will be the name of the map I want to load. And then we go ahead and tell this streaming level using the get streaming level and load next streaming level blueprint interface function to load the next streaming level. Blueprints cannot talk to other streaming levels using the remote event because the remote event is unique to level blueprints only. So what I had to do is when you click the blueprint button inside the UMG, I had to pass that information on back to my main menu blueprint right here, which is the load next streaming level. So that way it could take care of things like I have all the other ones do. And this one simply loads the next level, removes itself from the screen, sets the input back to game mode, and removes the cursor, since like I said, everything is intended to be compartmentalized. This blueprint changed the user interface mode, so this blueprint, when it's done, is changing it back. I call the remote event on the loading screen, and then I unload the main menu, since we're now done with the main menu. So we go ahead and go to our next one, which is going to be our loading screen. And you'll find this one's pretty simple as well. Same thing. Create a widget, set a widget, add it to the viewport, and then we go ahead and load the next level. The difference here is, since I don't know which level we're supposed to load, I need to get that from somewhere. And that is where our game instance came into play. I told the game instance to store the name of the next level. So now this is going to pull that information out and go ahead and load the next level. It's a nice way to use one blueprint that can basically be reused, and I can, for example, if my main menu, let's say we had our main menu loaded, assuming I can figure out where I put it. Let's go to our main menu. Okay. And let's say the continue function itself actually went into the save game, and then it pulled out the name of the continue point or your checkpoint, and then you had some other things to do, such as loading up save variables or verifying your saves are correct or communicating with the server. All of that information can be in the loading screen that's unique to that map, and you can pass that information back and forth using the game instance, so that way your loading screen here knows which map to load up. So we now tell it which map to load. I go ahead and delay 2 seconds. Again, I'm delaying just for effect. These maps are very, very tiny, so our loading time is near instantaneous on this machine, and you wouldn't be able to see the actual screen if I didn't have a delay here. If you have sorry about that. You may have many maps you need to load up. This may actually be a sequence, and you may need to load up your first part of your level, your next part of your level, your interior levels, your exterior levels. Using loading level streaming, since you can have, near unlimited amounts of maps themselves, you may have your actual game broken up into hundreds of unique maps, and you need to load up more than one. So using this, you can chain them together, and that loading screen, which if I go in here, is really simple. It's just a word with a little circle throbber that spins. Since this is displayed on your screen, and since you are loading the stream level without blocking, anything that happens in the background right here is just going to keep on chugging along and keep on going without affecting the screen. So, for example, let's say you had 15 levels to load. Well, using load stream level, you would know the name of each one. There's no reason you couldn't, for example, change this, and maybe down here you had the name, loading map 1, loading map 2, loading player inventory, and that way at least the player knows it's continuing to load and they have a nice little progress going on. You could even have a progress bar If you know you have 15 maps to load, you could have the progress bar update each time a map loads with the percentage. So, it's just, this is generic, and you can customize it to however you want. So, after we've loaded everything, I go ahead, and again, the loading screen needs to handle itself, so it's going to unload its widget. It's going to call the remote event on the next loaded level, and then it's going to unload itself. I went ahead and kept this as generic as possible. I simply named the remote event load level, and if I actually pull up the load level function inside of our first map, you'll find it's really simple. All I'm doing in this one is spawning the player. And this is just a generic helper function. Basically, I find the player start point, and I spawn in the player character, and I make sure I set our game mode to the appropriate amount, and then that's how the player plays. As a slight tweak, in our loading map 2, I do the load level, but before I spawn the player, because the spawn player is actually here, what I'm doing is actually playing our matinee, which allows the screen to fade in from black to fully clear so you can see it. But then I'm also setting a view target with blend, which is basically taking a camera in the scene, which if we look at our scene in map 2, you will see this camera. This camera is our starting camera. And once the scene loads, that camera is where we are visible. And what I'm telling it to do, just again, this is for an effect. This is something fun. Since every one of these levels is compartmentalized and unique, you can actually have all of them have a different introduction sequence if you need to, but they can all use the same loading function as long as they all implement that same custom event. So I'm just simply taking my existing camera, using the set view target with blend node, and saying, hey, go ahead and smoothly move into the player controller's camera, the spawn player's camera, and then I wait 2 seconds because it's a 2-second blend, so I tell it to wait 2 seconds. And then I go ahead and destroy that camera and then possess the player. And by possessing the player, I simply take control of the player so that way the player can actually go ahead and move. So, when we run through everything, splash screen, main menu, I choose an option. After I choose the option, that option is passed to my game instance. I load the loading screen. Loading screen takes that game instance variable, loads up that streaming level, and then once we have our map loaded, it goes ahead and plays any animation if I need to. And that's it. That's a quick and easy way to make a reusable loading system from a splash screen to a main menu to a loading screen to your actual in-game. That's actually really customizable. One thing you'll notice is since everything is in its own individual map, and every map is taking care of itself, and for example, the splash screen loads the splash screen UMG, loading screen uses the loading screen UMG, the main menu uses the main menu UMG, I could actually just take this system, drop it into a new project, and then customize the loading screen all by itself in its own map, customize the splash screen all by itself in its own map, customize the main menu. Everything is kept separate. If you have multiple people working on it, it's fantastic because one artist could actually be working on each individual screen completely independent of the person who's working on the maps themselves. And if you need to go back in and change one thing, since the screens themselves, each of these maps handle themselves, it doesn't matter. If your loading screen needs to be longer, you just go into your loading screen and you adjust it itself. Because the loading screen handles loading itself, doing whatever you want, and then unloading itself and starting up the next thing. So it's great. It's a nice, easy, reusable system, all thanks to the nice feature of streaming levels. And that's it. If there's anything else, feel free to put a comment below and let me know.